So, what happened was that I came across 2 papers on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And the reason why, again, it's sort of arbitrary, I stumbled across them. And the reason why they caught my attention was that the second paper reproduces the results of the first paper. So this is quite exciting, because then this makes it objective science, because now the results are verifiable, repeatable, and therefore predictable. And both these papers are cited everywhere as examples of good, solid scientific research. Again, I have no issue with mindfulness, but it's this particular take on it that I'm going to be questioning. Now, as many of you will know, mindfulness is said to be a part of the third wave of CBT treatments. I don't think it's connected with the Labour Party third wave, but anyway. The first wave was behaviourism itself, and the second wave began with the bolting of cognitivism onto behaviourism. And the ethos of this wave is primarily that of control, of thought control. And Layard says, the purpose of CBT is to train us directly to address our bad feelings and replace them with our positive ones. Now, the third wave is much softer. It draws on Eastern philosophies, and so in these treatment protocols, we find an abundance of terms like attachment, compassion, mindfulness, and acceptance. Now, in contrast to the second wave, where the ethos is control, the ethos of this wave is that of acceptance. So we have to ask, what characteristics do these waves share to allow them all to be called CBT? Well, to me, the characteristics have little to do with content and more to do with the way in which the treatment is legitimated and promulgated. To counter CBT, the treatments have to be tested and found to be efficacious by the conventions of empirical positivist science. Next, the treatments themselves should be manualised so that all practitioners closely follow in the footsteps of the study itself. Clearly, there are critical questions to be asked of this way of proceeding, and as all the other speakers have done so. But that's not going to be my focus. Instead, I'm going to take issue with these papers on the grounds of the very paradigm that they situate themselves, positivist empirical science, and show that in Ben Goldacre's pithy phrase that they are examples of bad science. So in order to do this, I'm going to have to buy in to a discourse and a way of thinking that I do not myself follow, which would be the medical model, the diagnostic categories, RCTs, but I'm going to buy into it and hold them to it rigorously and see what happens. But before I get into the science itself, I want to say something about the relationship of the third wave to Eastern philosophies. CBT strips out certain meditative practice from the philosophies and meaning worlds that have generated them and reduces them into sets of techniques and skills to be learnt. But in proceeding this way, not only have these practices been instrumentalized, but further, the end to which they have been instrumentalized constitutes a perversion of those very philosophies that generated them. For example, in the very same breath as mentioning the Buddha and mindfulness, Layard and Clark celebrate the fact that the resilience program is now being used for every soldier in the US Army with the aim of reducing incidents of post-traumatic stress disorder after traumatic experiences on the battlefield. In other words, the Buddhist practice of mindfulness is being used to turn human beings into more efficient, more resilient killing machines. Even so, despite the perversion, if CBT did in fact achieve what it claims to achieve, to the extent which it claims to achieve them, then in one sense that would be okay, whatever works. But as I will show, at least in this instance, this is not the case. I want to say something about the research culture in general. CBT has made an alliance with contemporary mainstream psychiatry. CBT has both stepped into as well as helped create and sustain a very particular kind of scientific research culture in which a number of assumptions have become unquestionable norms. First in line is the DSM and its psychiatric premise that A, there exist discrete mental illnesses that have a chemical or organic basis, that are some form of chemical imbalance, and that there are magic bullet treatments that can target the causes of these and fix them. Second, CBT positions itself within this discourse as the equivalent of drug treatment. CBT creates the impression that it is a kind of medicine with its appropriation of terms like dosages and inoculation. The research culture has largely been driven in directions that serve the interests of the pharmaceutical industry, with the connivance of their champions bought and paid for within academia. I'm going to use Ben Goldacre quite a bit in this. If you haven't read his Bad Pharma, do so. He says, 90% of published clinical trials are sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry, which means that they dominate the field, set the tone, they create the norms. Further, this research field is blighted by publication bias. Studies that fail to demonstrate that treatment X cures A simply do not see the light of day. So, how is it that industry-sponsored trials almost always manage to get a positive result? First, standards are set abysmally low. The regulatory authorities have agreed that all it need take is for 2 clinical trials to show a positive outcome for them to grant the treatment a license. And all that is meant by positive outcome is that the treatment is shown to be better than placebo. And the critical catch is this: there is no limit to the number of trials that can be conducted in search of these 2 significant trials. And finally, the researchers are not duty-bound to inform the research community or the public about their negative research result. There are attempts to change this, but according to Ben Goldacre, it's a long way still to go. Now, Goldacre again. This was first formally documented by a psychologist called Theodore Sterling in 1959. He went through every paper published in the 4 big psychology journals of the time and found that 286 out of 294 reported a statistically significant result. This, he explained, was plainly fishy. In 1995, at the end of his career, the same researcher came back to the same question and found that almost nothing had changed. How important is this, and why does it matter? Another group of researchers tracked all the registered trials for all the antidepressants that were launched between 1987 and 2004. 38 of the trials concluded that the treatment worked. Just lost my thing, yeah. And 36 found that the treatment did not. Now, out of the 38 trials that were successful, 37 were published. Out of the 36 trials, 3 were published. That left 33. 22 never saw the light of day. And astonishingly, the 11 were written up as if the drug were a success. Consequently, when anybody looks at the published research field to help make an informed decision, what do they find? They find 48 trials apparently demonstrating the efficacy of antidepressants, set against 3 that did not. I repeat, 48 saying that they worked and 3 saying they did not, and the 22 have magically disappeared. I want to mention one other aspect of the norm that will be relevant to us. In medicine, the practice of off-label prescribing is prevalent. And what is meant by this is, say a drug is licensed to treat elderly men for disease X. This drug can then get prescribed to a young man or a woman for disease Y or Z. When this practice, and it's commonplace practice, this is known as off-label prescribing. So companies are quite glad just to get a license for one little thing, and then it gets used up for a whole load of things. So just to keep that in mind, So in sum, over the last decades, there's been a consistent trend towards deregulation for the benefit of the pharmaceutical industry. This then is the research culture in which the science of CBT is cultivated, a culture of low standards and at times outright deceit. And as is bound to be the case, the science of CBT is contaminated by the culture in which it is grown and cultivated. So what does a clinical trial actually look like? And I was having to educate myself in all of this, and maybe it's all quite familiar to you. But say you want to test the efficacy of a treatment, which could be a drug or some psychotherapy treatment or whatever, but let's call it ZON. And you want to test this for a disease called X. Well, the first thing you notice you collect 100 people who are there, and then some of them are already suffering from Y and Z, some are too old, some are too young. You get rid of a whole lot, and you end up with 20. So you take this 20 and you put them through a randomized control trial. Fine, you give half of them ZON and you give the other half placebo. And then 6 years later you look at them, and my God, those on ZON, 70% of them are in remission and 20% on placebo. So ZON is doing something good. So that's what the results look like. The next thing you have to do is cancel out the number in the control group with the treatment group to reveal what the treatment group actually does. So that's what happens. And then we look at it and say, it's worked on 50% of the people. That's a good result. Now, what happens next is the way the drug is promoted. The drug is, ZON is now said to have scientifically proven to cure X, when actually the claim should be that it works more often than not. It works some of the time with some people. In other words, it is guaranteed it will not work on a percentage of the population. What happens next is that it is conveniently forgotten that the drug has been tested on a particularly skewed population, on just 20% of those known to be suffering from X. The language used in the literature and journal abstracts are mostly without caveats, suggesting that ZON is the treatment of choice for all those suffering from X, the entire 100. And I realize actually I should have put the smiley faces over the entire 100. And when ZON is prescribed to the 80% not included in this original study, it is a form of off-label prescribing. Well, the mythical story of ZON is not all that mythical. One study found that just 6% of representative asthma sufferers would have been eligible to participate in asthma treatment trials. And quite astonishingly, out of every 8 people suffering from depression who actually volunteered to take part in treatment trials, only 1 was deemed to be eligible. So the evidence base for CBT is constructed in exactly this kind of manner. And I'll look briefly at just one paper. And the title of the paper is there, Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, and it's published in The Lancet, so a very prestigious journal. And in this, they take 469 patients, 235 Tao. Tao, by the way, is not a new Chinese philosophy. So treatment as usual, and 234 get CBT plus treatment as usual. And the press release says this. At 6 months, 46% who received CBT had improved, and 20% compared to usual care. And the bottom paragraph is the sort of punchline. The findings demonstrate that it is an effective treatment that reduces depressive symptoms and so on and so forth. So, right? So that's their study. And at 6 months, that's how it looks. And then we have to cancel out the people from the 2 groups. And it leaves us with 24%, which they never mention. So, the important figure for research purposes is not the 46% they cite, but 24%. In other words, the research showed that about 2 out of 10 more people came to feel better because of this treatment. and this improvement has taken place in combination with treatment as usual, presumably drug therapy. Now, I'm sure many people have been helped and are being helped, and this surely is a good thing, but it is not an overwhelmingly good thing, at least not to the degree which it is trumpeted in the rhetoric. But there's another inflated claim smuggled into the reportage. Notice that even the successful 24% were by no means cured of depression. What the subjects reported was that their symptoms of depression were reduced by about 50%. So the way the study ought to be announced is about 2 out of 10 more people came to feel somewhat better because of having received CBT. However, although better, they are still depressed, only less depressed. The culmination of this kind of research in prestigious scientific journals has meant that it has now become established scientific fact that CBT is unquestionably an entirely effective therapy. For example, here on the website of the prestigious Royal College of Psychiatrists, this statement is entirely without any caveats or cautions. And it reads rather like the medicines, snake oil medicine that promises all things to all people. Also, because it's numbers, physics, statistics, when they say things like 50%, what do we mean by that? It counts itself as science because it says it is producing objective knowledge. Objective knowledge means something that we can count and measured and so forth. Well, the number of people at a bus stop is objective, a number. But when I say 50% less reduction, what does that mean? Well, as Oliver James was saying, what it means is they ask you the question, how depressed are you on a scale of? And because you give a number, and because the numbers are added up, this subjective information is then disguised and made to appear as though it were objective. But actually, it is subjective. Your answer 3 and my answer 2 are subjective expressions of our feelings. Well, I want to just turn to the papers themselves. Now, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to stay with the first paper. And the title of it is this: Prevention of Relapse Recurrence in Major Depression by Mindfulness Based Cognitive Therapy. Well, the very first word in the title is compelling: prevention. It suggests that the treatment will halt the recurrence of major depression. And this is exactly what we find in the abstract. MBCT offers a promising, cost-efficient psychological approach to preventing relapse recurrence in recovered, recurrently depressed patients. But when we dip into the paper itself, we find that their research question is in fact much more modest in its aspirations, as it speaks of reduction, not prevention. Does this intervention, when offered in addition to tau, reduce rates of relapse and recurrence compared to tau alone? In the body of their paper, they freely bounce from prevent to reduce and back again as it suits them. Well, which is it, and does it matter? Is the intention of the research, the treatment, to prevent, a very strong and compelling claim, or is it merely to reduce, worthy but not so sexy? This confusion, or is it a slight sleight of hand? This confusion allows the researchers to have their cake and eat it too, which is illustrated in the very first sentence of the paper. I'll let you read that. Well, if relapse and recurrence is common, then in what sense is it being claimed that the prior treatment, whatever it was successful? I am reminded of the old joke, operation successful, patient dead. CBT has its own version of this joke. When patients do not get better through the good offices of CBT, or they drop out of treatment, then they become beneficiaries of an additional diagnosis, CBT resistant. That is a term in the literature. So, what was this study and how did it go on? So, normally CBT treatments are delivered to people whilst they're depressed to try and get them less depressed, like an earlier study. What this was doing was looking at people who've had previous episodes of depression and have recovered from them, and whilst they're not depressed, they get a training in MBCT in order to help them not become depressed in the future. And so the whole thing was as this, that they were given one orientation session, then they had 8 weeks in a group of 12 participants with one instructor, which they had homework and so forth. Then over the next 52 weeks, they each had 4 follow-up sessions, and so the total study was 60 weeks. And so the question that the researchers had to ask at the end was, are the people who receive MBCT better off than those who did not? And if so, by how much? Well, they start out by collecting a certain number of people, and quite a few drop out initially. And they say this: of the 13 patients allocated to MBCT, 6 failed to attend any training sessions, and 7 dropped out after attending fewer than 4. So this 13 are not included in any of the calculations. It's worth pausing to think about this a moment. The conventional rationale for not including the 13 would be that as they did not take part in the treatment, we have no data on them. But in any analysis that is more than a simplistic arithmetic one, we would have to ask, why did these 6 adults decide not to proceed with the treatment after the orientation session? Was it a meaningful, rational choice, or were they simply disorganized and CBT resistant? So, rather than saying the 6 failed to attend, we could say the 6 elected not to attend. And the same could be said of the 7 who dropped out. And if this were indeed the case, then surely the 13 should be included amongst those for whom CBT does not work its magic. Anyway, onto the study itself. So they end up with 137 people for whom they have complete data, as they say. So we start off with the happy faces, because at the moment they're not depressed. They get split up into 2, and half have tau, and half have MBCT plus tau. And 60 weeks later, this is what we find. That in the tau group, excuse me, my reading, 58% have relapsed, and in the MBCT group, 44% have relapsed. So, in this paper, these numbers are not written in. You don't find these actual numbers. I had to find them in different places and add it up to say this. Why? Because it's actually a rather pathetic result. It shows that between 1 and 2 people got better in total by this treatment in this group. So by the people who know how to do these things, statistically it is not significant. The null hypothesis is still true. And if we added the 13, it would be even more invidious. However, it turns out that the figures for relapse rate are much better for a subset of this population. It turns out that those who had had 3 or more previous episodes of depression, they discovered that for this group, for some reason not known, fewer members of this group relapse in comparison to those to the 2 or more group. 2 or less, sorry. Now, the paper spends all its time highlighting this result, and it highlights it to such a degree that it obscures everything else, including this. So, about the 3 or more group, this subgroup, they say this: over the total study period, 40% of MBCT participants experience relapse, and 66% of tau participants. So remember, it was 137, and so 105 of them have had 3 or more previous episodes of depression. And this was a treatment, and 60 weeks later, more people in the treatment as usual group got that, and so this is how it looks. And so obviously the treatment has done some good for this group. This is how it looks. We cancel out the control group with the treatment group. Which leaves, would you agree, 26%? A figure never cited in the paper. What they say is that, I quote, they say this shows a 39% reduction in risk of relapse recurrence in the MBC condition. Where has the 39% come from? I had no idea. I spoke to statisticians and so forth. And I'm, what is going on? Well, how should we think about a study like this? So here's one way to think about it. The treatment as usual group, people who had no treatment at all, 66% of them relapsed, right? Call this number X. We take another group and we give them the treatment, and we count the number who relapsed, call them Y. Well, if the same number relapse in the treatment group and the control group, then the treatment is useless. If fewer people relapse in the treatment group, as it is so in this case, then the treatment is beneficial. And if more people fall ill in the treatment group, then the treatment is harmful, is iatrogenic. So in our case, clearly it is more beneficial, and I simply think 66 minus 40 equals 26. How do they work? How do they get to 29? This is how they calculate the 39%. They start with the same numbers, and instead of subtracting them, they divide it, and then take it away from 100. Well, what is the 26 describing, and what is the 39 describing? Which number is meaningful? Here, I need to say something about absolute and relative differences. I have a secret, actually, which can increase your chances of winning the lottery by 400%. If you follow me, you can win it increase your chances by 400%. And my secret is buy 4 tickets. Well, I have not lied to you. I have increased your chances by 400% relative to your original chance. But in reality, your initial chance was 1 in 14 billion, and your new chance is 4 out of 14 billion. That's the difference between absolute and relative. Well, it's something similar taking place with these other figures. In absolute terms, you are 26% better off, and this other 39% is, I've lost my figures, sorry. The 39% is a relative reduction in risk relative to the 66%. Now, to my mind, as a sufferer of depression, the number I would want to know, what I would want to know is what difference would it make to me if I joined the MBCT group? What difference would that make to my well-being? And I can see that I would reduce my chances of relapse, no prevention. I reduce my chances of relapse by 26% if I join the MBCT group. Fine. I cannot put into words what 39% means to me, to my experience. I literally cannot get my head around it. So I think the 39% is a mathematical mystification rather than actual information. But of course, 26% is not as impressive as 39%. I have checked this now with 3 statisticians, and they would agree with this. And I've also, Roger Porges points out that if you do 39% of 66, you actually arrive at the number 26. So they are speaking about the same thing, but in this muddled way. So it is part of the art of obfuscation not to trouble the reader by informing them that the reduction in risk they are citing is relative rather than absolute, nor to trouble them with what the absolute reduction actually is, nor to reveal the actual calculations used to derive the figures in the first place. Nevertheless, let us allow them their 39%. Let's give it to them. Now, what do they do with it? They say, in participants with 3 or more previous episodes, an adequate dose of MBCT, almost halved, So we've now got to almost half. So 39%, which is less than 4 out of 10, has been morphed into almost half. The 39% has been increased by 11%, which is over 25% of the original figure. Well, a little later, a couple of paragraphs later, we have this. The almost has disappeared. Now, the halving of relapse rates in a group of high risk would appear to be a clinically useful outcome. So in a few paragraphs, we've gone from 26%, which is never even mentioned, to 39%, to almost a half, and then to a half. And indeed, this is the message that is broadcast to all and sundry, that MBCT halves the relapse rate of all those who are prone to depression. And sure enough, this is exactly what we find on the official MBCT website. And the whole thing is there, and the highlighted bits at the bottom. It reduces rates of relapse by 50% among the patients who suffer from recurrent depression. Now, there are no caveats there. And let us look at the transmutation process. We start off in the field of numbers with the number 39. And then we translate this into words. And 39 is almost a half. And almost a half is really a half. And once we get to a half, we can go back to numbers, and we're at 50%. If they'd done it deliberately, it would be very clever. But this is the art of obfuscation. To my mind, to say 50% on this website is nothing less than a lie. The economic argument for this treatment also falsely emphasizes prevention in lieu of likelihood and reduction. They say that the preventative effect of MBCT was achieved for an average investment of less than 5 hours of instructor time per patient, suggesting that this is a cost-efficient strategy for prevention. Fund holders are bound to be excited at the prospect of preventing depression for hardly any cost at all, for 5 hours work per patient. And that figure actually is wrong, but never mind that. But note in passing that in this statement there is no therapist present. What we find is an instructor. So rather than calling this therapy, surely it ought to be referred to as an educational program. Nothing wrong with that. We should simply call a spade a spade. So that's the 3 or more category. What about the 2 or less? Well, it would seem that MBCT did not help them much at all. The researchers say that it had no prophylactic effects, that, anyway, it didn't do that much. There's no evidence of benefits, it's relatively unhelpful, and so on. What are the actual figures? Those 32 people, by the way, yeah, out of that. So this is what they say. I'll let you read it. I will do. Okay, I will do. Okay. Over the total study period, 56%, 9 out of 16, of MBCT participants experienced relapse, compared with 31% Tau participants. Yeah, have you noticed? More of the people who received MBCT relapsed compared to those who did not. 25% more of them. Yet the researchers do not say that the treatment made them ill. They say that there is no evidence of benefit. to this group. Surely, on the same grounds that they claim that MBCT is efficacious for the 3 or more group, they ought to say that MBCT is positively harmful to those who have suffered 2 or less. The differentials are almost identical. The numbers are small, true. And if we put these figures through the same kind of calculation that they put the other figures through, where they arrived at 39%, if we put it through the same thing, we arrive at the astonishing fact that this treatment will increase your chances of relapsing by 80%. But what they say is, statistics and p-values, that they show a non-significantly greater tendency to relapse. That is the technical term, significant. Now, I've come across a new idea called p-hacking. P-hacking. Statisticians use this notion of p, mentioned by Jonathan Shedler, to say whether their findings are statistically significant or not. And in this arena, the convention is that if p is less than 5%, then the results are considered to be statistically significant. And p-hacking must be rife, because almost every published study magically ends up under this threshold. And as we noticed earlier, Sterling pointing out how 286 of 294 papers were just at this threshold. And p-hacking is relatively easy because of the conventions, because researchers do not share their raw data, nor do they declare the way in which they calculate p. All they do is to state its value embedded in a mix of dense hieroglyphics, which immediately sap you of your will to live and look like this. You see why I call it Return of the Repressed. So it is on the basis of this kind of statistical thing that they're able to dismiss the fact that the subgroup is positively harmed by MBCT. And the second study actually reproduced this side of things as well. There are a number of further issues, elements in the paper that fall short of the self-aggrandizing rhetoric endemic to CB discourse. Its claim that its research methods are scientifically rigorous. Well, if the authors of this study were truly rigorous, then they would have to curtail their claims even further. This is because the participants in this study, it turns out, were mainly women, and close to 100% of them were white. So, the findings as such are limited to the category white women. And to utilize this treatment with any other social grouping or the other gender would be a form of off-label prescribing. It is also the case that there's no way of knowing how and why those in the MBCT group, in this particular category, 3 or less MBCT group, relapse less than those in the Tau group. Because apart from anything else, over the 60-week period, those in the MBCT group accessed other forms of help more than the Tau group. They visited their GP for depression-related issues 6% more than the Tau group. They reached out for counselling 15% more than the Tau group. And the MBCT group used medication 5% more than the Tau group. Therefore, according to the principles and conventions of empirical science, the study cannot unequivocally demonstrate that the reduction in relapse rates was due to MBCT, or whether it was due to the additional help they accessed over the 60 weeks. In all these, in the NICE guidelines and reports, there are always little tokenistic gestures towards the limitations of the study, which lend these studies and papers an air of scientific humility, but they are tokenistic. They say things like this: the sample sizes in 2 groups mean that the estimates of risk have appreciable margins of error. They even confess that after treatment for the good group, the relapse recurrence rate in patients was clearly substantially above the expected annual incidence rate. It is clear that the intervention did not reduce risks of major depression to the normal range. See, in putting in sentences like this into these papers, they've ticked certain boxes, and then they can carry on as normal. And all is forgotten in the triumphalism we find in the journal abstract, which is all a busy professional is likely to have the time to read. So, conclusions. So, the evidence base for CBT is of the statistical kind, which speaks to likelihoods, but it is presented as though it were generating indisputable objective facts, no different from the disciplines of physics and mathematics. Now, this next point I think is important. It is the case, as I've understood it, but I've learned something a bit different today, that both the supporters and detractors of CBT are generally in agreement that in round figures, CBT is of benefit to about 50% of the population. This is what tends to be cited. And it is on this sort of figure that the Exchequer has been persuaded to part with eye-watering amounts of money. But if it is found to be the case that the figures we have come across in this study are representative of the CBT research base in general, then something more worrying is going on. So if the figures are not the 50%, but actually 25%. And is this generally true of the research base? And if this is the case, then we would have to ask, is the whole CBT research base infected and corrupted by these kinds of statistical malpractices? I doubt if the Exchequer would be all that keen to empty the public purse on the more realistic but much more meagre promises of reduction in likelihood rather than prevention, and a reduction of 25% rather than 50%. So when all is said and done, this is how I think this study should actually present itself to the world. So over the period of a year, MBCT is likely to reduce the chances of relapse into depression for something between 2 or 3 out of every 10 people within a very specific group of patients. And this grouping is white women who are not currently depressed. Further, they should have previously suffered at least depression on at least 3 occasions and have recovered from it. More, the depression ought not to be caused by actual life events, but fed by autonomous ruminative thinking. It is also the case that about 4 out of 10 people within this group, almost half, will continue to relapse despite the treatment. And of those who have suffered or recovered from 2 or less previous episodes, 80% are more likely to become ill because of the treatment. However, they will be relieved to know that although the suffering caused by MBCT might be personally problematic, it is statistically not significant. In sum, the treatment does not prevent relapse. It merely reduces the likelihood of relapse by 26%. So, despite the range of caveats supplied by the researchers themselves, despite the fact that most of those who will receive the treatment will not be helped, despite the fact that those with 2 or less episodes will actually be made to feel considerably worse, despite the fact that this treatment is deemed to be inappropriate for anyone who is depressed because of a life event, most of humankind surely, the researchers are nevertheless able to end their abstract with the rousing statement, entirely devoid of caveats. MBCT offers a promising, cost-effective, psychological approach to preventing relapse recurrence in recovered, recurrently depressed patients. But even worse, many of the great and the good, governments and policymakers, have been gullible enough to believe them, squander prodigious amounts of public money, and perversely cause more positive harm to many of the inhabitants of this land. Thanks.